Welcome Team 8B. Today we're going to talk about the Maya, really cool civilization of Mesoamerica. Real quick, what we're looking at this screen currently. Obviously this is the temple at Chichen Itza, one of the northern cities. We've actually discussed this in the past. This is one of the most well-preserved example of Mayan architecture, and probably one of its most famous. As we'll look in the future in this presentation, we'll see this has some really interesting archaeological interests and architectural qualities that make it very unique. If we look at our timeline before we move on, see where the Maya are in history. Now you'll notice that we've added a light green stretch on the left of the timeline and a light green stretch on the right. We'll discuss that in a future slide, but just to give us some context of where they are in history compared to the other Mesoamerican civilizations of the Olmec, the Aztec, and the Inca. Our objectives today, things we want to walk away knowing, we want to understand the role of geography in a civilization's rise. We have discussed this in the past when talking about geography and talking about the Olmec. We want to understand how civilizations rise and fall. With the Maya, we're going to get an interesting look at how a civilization goes from pre-civilization conditions to a thriving civilization to ultimately destruction. And we're going to understand how belief can drive a civilization's actions. We're going to look at the religion and how that made the Maya act one way or another. The Maya were an indigenous culture, remember that word meaning native or already there, that was one of the most advanced civilizations in the Western Hemisphere before the Europeans arrived. They were an absolutely amazingly advanced culture, especially compared to those that were already on the Americas. They can trace their heritage back about 2000 BCE, though the peak of their civilization is from about 300 to 900 Common Era. Like the Olmec, and really like all civilizations, it's the boom in farming that causes this massive growth of population that leads to labor division, that leads to cities, and ultimately to civilization. The Maya are no different than anyone else. Here, looking at the timeline, you can see an estimation of where in history the Maya existed. That dark green highlighted section you see from about 250 to 900 CE represents the peak of Mayan civilization, the height of their advancement, when cities were being built, when math was being done. On either side you'll notice a lighter green. This is to indicate that the Maya are still existing, though they are not at their height and they are not perhaps at the level we would call a civilization. As we discussed in the previous slide, the Maya can trace their history to about 2000, 1500 roughly BCE. Stretching to the right, you'll notice another green, lightly green section, and this represents the Maya that were still living on the Yucatan Peninsula and its environs after the fall of their civilization. This is true. We often associate a mystery with the Maya, but the truth be told, we know where they went, and they went back to the fishing villages and back to the farming villages that they had once come from. Just to the right of that, you'll notice a very light green section, and this is to indicate a post-European contact section of their timeline. The Europeans did have contact with the Maya, and that's how we know so much about them. You'll notice that that does end. Much like the other civilizations of Mesoamerica and their contact with the Europeans, it does eventually lead to their destruction. Just for a little historical context, I'm going to put a few events on the board, including the fall of Rome, the beginning of the Crusades, the date of Columbus's sailing, though honestly that might want to be a little to the right, and the American Revolution. So we can see where in history, compared to dates we may be familiar with, the Maya existed. We may also want to look at the span of time, if we consider the time of the United States from the American Revolution to current day, noticing the UR here arrow, the span of the Mayan civilization is considerably longer. Around 1500 BCE, the Maya begin to establish their pre-civilization in the highlands and lowlands of Mesoamerica, in particular this area on the Yucatan Peninsula and just to its south and east. I'm going to open this map, and we're going to take a quick look. Here's the area that they existed in. Will be highlighted in green. So the green area is the span that we often associate with the Maya. To compare this to modern day countries, we can take a look here and we can see the modern state of Mexico, the modern Guatemalan state, the modern Belizean state, Honduras, El Salvador. This would be an area of the world that we might call Central America, but we'll still use that moniker, Mesoamerica. Make that go away. You too. So much like our previous cultures, and really like a lot of the cultures we're going to talk about, the Mayans had a very strict and powerful class structure. This division of labor, or rather division of labor, is what led to this. There were mostly four main classes. We had the ruling class, which included kings. In Mayan civilization, kings would rule each one of the cities, and may go to war from time to time with the other cities around them. The nobility, which was made up of warriors, architects, scholars, merchants, anyone who was wealthy, anyone who was educated would make up the nobility. Remember, the nobility is still a kind of ruling class that possesses a number of powers and rights that others may not. The peasants were the lowest class, obviously, the vast majority of Mayans, and were, like the Olmec, mostly farmers, laborers, fishers. The Maya did have an extra class of slaves, or rather, if the Olmec had them, we do not have records of that. But slaves were typically criminals, war prisoners, or, sadly, orphaned children. Remember, when we talk about class structure, we often talk about triangles, so please keep that in mind. The farmers lived in small villages near the big cities. They grew, like the Olmec, maize, beans, squash, peppers, avocados, cacao, pineapples, and more. Though, as we have driven really into your heads, maize is the most important. They used a variety of techniques to grow their crops. The techniques used included slash and burn, which we've discussed before as being where one cuts down a forest and burns what is left. Rotated fields, where you would have a field, but you would not use that field every year, and rather let that year go fallow or unused for 10 years. In the highlands, they would cut terraces or steps into the mountain in order to give themselves more space to farm on. They also used other things such as raising fields, cultivating terraces, and fruit tree orchards. So the Mayans got their food through a number of different ways. You talk about housing. Small villages consisted of many compounds that you would live in with your extended family. So you would imagine being with not only your brothers and sisters, but aunts, uncles, their children, and perhaps grandparents as well. The houses were thatch roofed. If you take a look here, we can see that's what a thatch roof looks like. And usually one-room huts with walls of poles covered in dry mud. They were used to sleep in, as most of your other actions, including cooking, was done outside. The men, in a division of labor between the genders, built the hut and cared for the crops, while the women made clothes, prepared the food, and tended to the domestic needs. It was, of course, another time. When we talk about the nobility, we're talking about, of course, your wealthy and your educated, your warriors, your scholars, etc. They lived in houses made of plaster that were covered in beautiful murals. This is actually a really important point, as they were the only classes to actually have murals in their households. They're the ones who wore the fancy jewelry, the fancy clothing. They wore jaguar skins, they had jade, they had shells. They wore all of the highest fashions at the time. And they ate considerably better. Where most peasants ate exactly what they grew, the nobles, through importing all of this food from the villages, ate a wide variety of foods, including the chocolate drink made of cacao, which was reserved only for royalty. The rulers, these are the people who live in the stone houses. Their palaces still stand today, and there are two examples here of Mayan palaces, obviously in great states of disrepair. You can see the grandeur that they lived in, obviously much better than the mud huts of the villagers. The Maya believed in another pantheon of gods, a lot of which they inherited from the Olmec. We can see here that they had sun gods, moon gods, death gods, war gods, and rain gods. They believed that one of the creators of their world was a god called Itzimna. And if you guys remember the creator story, this was one of the shapers and framers that was listed. In order to get help from the gods, the Mayans prayed and fasted and offered sacrifices, animals, and occasionally humans. The Maya did not practice regular human sacrifice. We'll talk more about that with the Aztec, but they did do it once in a while. The Maya viewed the afterlife as an unhappy experience. They saw it as a cold, dreadful area that you wanted to avoid. If we take a look at one of the more interesting things, this is that temple at Chichen Itza that we looked at earlier. Once a year, the shadows made by the sun make it look like a serpent, or the feathered serpent Kukulkan, is descending down the stairs. In one of these frames, you can actually see his head, and it looks like his slithering body. It's another discussion we can have about the advancement of the Maya, where they were able to build a massive structure that took into account the movement of the sun. The ball game was one of the many religious ceremonies they practiced. Here you can see a picture of a ball court. There were many, many different kinds, usually performed on the top of pyramids, but the ball game held a special, significant area of their life, harkening back to that creation story of the hero twins. And here is an artist depiction of what that may have looked like. It was the object was kind of like racquetball. You'd hit the ball back and forth, trying to keep the ball in the court. Later on, a stone ring was added as another way to score points. This was not just any game. This was religiously significant, and sometimes the losers were executed. There were about 40 cities. We're only going to discuss a few: Copan, Tikal, Palenque, Bonampak, and Chichen Itza. In fact, we can take a look at where they exist on this map here. Once again, we have the span of the Maya in green, and these cities marked by the little pyramids. You can take a look at just one of the pictures from each of them. You can see that similar construction and similar needs. What we're also seeing to the side, by the way, is a stela. Much like the people of Mesopotamia or the Greeks, they created these stone pillars that would often tell a story, covered in glyphs that might relate events or dates. We have already kind of discussed this, but we do want to take a moment to talk about their advancement in mathematics. So we understand their number system, the existence of a 365-day calendar, the Ha'ab, the 260-day Tzolk'in, and just as a point of interest, we can also take a look at today's date, which is actually not going to work. That's okay. We also talk about the concept of these codices. This is how we know so much about the Maya. This picture you're seeing here is from something called the Dresden Codex that actually depicts the destruction of the world at the end of the Third Era. This is the one that is going to destroy those mud people. So a codex is going to be a book made of bark that's covered in sacred markings and in glyphs. Going across the screen now, you're going to see the whole of the Dresden Codex. You can see it's a lot of information that scholars can use to really understand a lot about the Maya. In the 800s CE, Common Era, the Maya, for whatever reason, abandon their cities. They simply get up and leave, and the population sharply declines. We do not know why there was a sudden decline in population. Some like to theorize that it was over-farming or food shortages, that there was disease, warfare, or that the peasants revolted. We do know that the people of the Mayan people still existed on the Yucatan Peninsula for some time, really up until the arrival of the Europeans. And like much of the story after that, the arrival of the Europeans, the Maya will be almost summarily destroyed. Remember, guys, you wanted to have taken some notes on this. Feel free to go back and view anything again. Hopefully you enjoyed the music that was overplaying that. And I hope you guys have a great day. Remember, this is due Thursday. Thank you.